Good evening. Welcome and thank you. It's wonderful to see such a big crowd of people on Sanibel that really are interested in the island's history and heritage. My companions here are members of the Sanibel Historical Preservation Committee, and we've been working on this project for 6 years. Now, please remember that we are not public speakers. And so tonight, our presentation is not going to be very formal. We will ask for questions, comments, what have you. But I'm the chairperson. I'm Deb Gleason. And we're very happy to be part of the Twilight talks with the Historical Museum and their sponsor, Sanibel Captiva Trust. And we'd just like to thank them. Now, we couldn't do anything as a committee without the planning department. And tonight we have Roy Gibson here with us, our fearless leader. And Craig Chandler, who has been our right-hand man through all of this. And he will be leading us tonight.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Craig Chandler. I'm a planner with the City of Sanibel Planning Department, and I'm so proud to be here in front of everybody to talk a little bit about the Heritage Trail Project, which, as Deb mentioned, has been in the works for now about 5 to 6 years. So having said that, I'm going to try and do my best to summarize this in about 10 minutes. A little bit of background on the trail. Something that you may not know is that this is not the first historical education trail on the island. In fact, in 1998, this committee moved to install 37 historic markers. And those markers form the historic walking and bicycle tour of Old Town Sanibel for the lighthouse end, and then a second trail for the west end of Sanibel. Here are those historic markers today. And so for those who can't see, the marker on the left, the plaque is in fact fallen completely off of the stand. For the marker on the right, there are blotches of green algae all over there, which I'm sure our guests don't enjoy seeing. So the time came in 2011 for the committee to propose a new trail and new markers as a part of that trail. But instead of just doing a marker that commemorates the site, they proposed interpretive panels. This is a map of where those 21 interpretive panels are going to be located. Here's a closer look at what those panels are. They're going to be a little more durable, weather resistant, and they're going to provide a lot more information about Sanibel history. In total, 18 topics of Sanibel's history are going to be covered by the 21 panels on the trail. And now to get that information, this is what took the longest amount of time for our committee, was compiling all the research. They went through over 40 books, over 2,000 pages of newspaper, numerous oral history interviews, and many archival photos from the Sanibel Library. And here are a couple of those photographs. The left is the Bailey's General Store in 1927, and the right is a group of baseball players from the Sanibel Tomato Pickers Intramural League. And this project has been a collaborative effort, so I feel it's appropriate that we recognize now, in addition to the committee, members of the city, the library, there were organizations in the county as well as the state that supported this effort. And so to get started on the Sanibel Trail, how are you going to do that? Well, we have map guides that are going to be printed out and distributed across the island at businesses and institutions that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the Chamber of Commerce, the Shell Museum, SCCF. And in addition to that, to make it even easier for folks to access this information, there are going to be printable map guides on the website as well as a smartphone application. So for those who have downloaded the Sanibel Traffic Cam app, it'll function in a similar way. There's going to be a map on that application. You can turn on your GPS and see where you're located relative to some of the stops on the trail, and that way folks can navigate without getting lost on our shared use path system. So without any more delay, I'm going to pass this on to Don Adams as a member of the committee. He's going to be followed by Jim Pickens, Yvonne Hill, Sheila Fortney, Ty Simrosky, Susan Cassell, and the chair of the committee, Deborah Gleason. Each of them are going to discuss aspects of Sanibel's history. These are topics that are going to be featured on the Heritage Trail. And please keep an eye out for that smartphone app and the map guide. These are things that are going to be released fairly soon. It's something we've been working on for a while now, and we're expecting this to be complete this summer. So thank you so much for your time and listening, and here's Don Adams.
Yeah. The first trip my wife Jane and I made to Sanibel was a drive-through in 1989. We thought Sanibel seemed different from the rest of Florida. We came back in 1992 curious about Sanibel and why it was different. We learned that islanders, the residents themselves, had worked to preserve the environment and to save the island's pioneer history in the Historical Museum and Village, and that the Historical Preservation Committee was one of the first committees to be formed when Sanibel became a city. Among the many museums and communities I had worked with, I thought Sanibel stood out, even to the point of deserving national recognition. As an associate member of the Society of American Travel Writers, I had a path to accomplish this. The Society's highest award, the Phoenix, given periodically in recognition of countries, states, or individuals that had succeeded in preserving their environment and their cultural heritage. I read everything I could find about Sanibel, submitted an application, and a panel of travel writers, judges selected Sanibel for the award. It was the first time in the award's 38-year history that it had been given to the residents of a community. At the presentation, January 28, 1994, Sam Bailey was a master of ceremonies. Proclamations from Governor Lawton Chiles and Gary Ford, editor of Southern Living magazine, were read. City manager Gary Price said to the Sanibel residents, "Pat yourselves on the back for this award." I had the honor of presenting the award, traveling here from our home in Detroit, and this is a picture of me, believe it or not. That's how I looked before this project. Presenting this to Jerry Munch, the mayor at the time of Sanibel. In the award application, it was emphasized that the island school became one of the first in the region to be racially desegregated. It spoke of the residents' battle for home rule, the impact of the causeway, and the groundbreaking Sanibel plan. But when Jane and I moved to Sanibel as year-round residents in 1999, we found that in spite of the good work the Historical Museum and Village were doing at presenting the island's pioneer history, a lot of the stories that had been presented to the Phoenix Award judges were not readily accessible to the public. I met with Sanibel City Manager Judy Zamamra to discuss how I might volunteer to share some of my experience. She suggested the Sanibel Historical Preservation Committee. At one of the first meetings, Chair Deb Gleason asked for volunteers to evaluate the site markers along the mixed-use path. Lynn Campion and I volunteered. We photographed all of them, made a report on their condition, and May 5th, 2011, recommended to the committee that we begin the creation of a new heritage trail. starting with researching Sanibel's history. I thank my wife, Jane, for her forbearance during the times when my work on this project over the next 5 years sometimes became rather intense. The committee reviewed about 40 books, as was mentioned earlier, involving Sanibel history. The library, Sanibel Library and State Archives provided archival photos. The library, thousands of pages of newspaper clippings, which Marty Ponader and I went through, photographing the most pertinent articles. We reviewed oral history interviews. After more than a year of research, we drafted text for 21 panels, which together would address the key stories in shaping the Sanibel of today. Sanibel City Council gave conceptual approval, freeing the city to commit the planning department to working with us to bring the Heritage Trail to fruition. The Heritage Trail could not have been produced without the support of the City Council, especially Marty Harity, our council liaison, the work of all the members of the Historical Preservation Committee, particularly Deb Gleason and Lynn Campion, the library staff, especially Betty Anholt, and the support of the City of Sanibel, especially Judy Zamamra, Jim Jordan, Roy Gibson, and Craig Chandler, and the leaders of many organizations represented on the panels, especially Christy Anders of SCCF. On behalf of the committee, I thank all these people and the many others who have participated. And now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Jim.
Thank you, Don. Well, they gave me agriculture. 10 minutes, I'm supposed to tell you everything you need to know about agriculture as it took place on Sanibel Island over a period of 100 years. So knowing I can't do that, I'm really just going to only deal with two things. And that is, why did Sanibel farming largely cease in the 1920s? And the other thing is, why was some large-scale farming still going on in the early 1950s? Two almost diverse things that don't seem to fit together. But I'd like to introduce you to some really, I think, interesting things that go on. I selected this photograph that you see up here behind me for a couple of reasons. One is I personally knew both families that are represented in that photograph. That's Stark Caraway on the left and Belden Johnson on the right. I'm still communicating with Belden Johnson's stepdaughter who lives in Ponta Gorda. Note the expanse of that tomato field. That's covering an awful lot of territory. And that picture was taken in 1912. It's enormous, and notice that there's virtually no trees there. There's one cabbage palm kind of in the center, and then in the distance you can see a few more. I brought along some comparison aerial photos that if you want to look at them after the fact, that shows what it used to be like and what it's like now. And it's different, trust me. My parents' house, we were in the middle of the island, about where Sea Grape Lane is now. You could sit in my parents' living room and you could see both the bay and the Gulf from there. Sam Bailey once told me that when he was a kid growing up, he could stand on the porch of the Bailey house, look down the road through the clearing across the Sanibel River and see the Gulf. I mean, that's just how little vegetation was growing in there. I would like to talk about a popular story. A popular story is that the large-scale farming on Sanibel ended in 1926 with a hurricane that put salt poisoning in the soil clear across the island. And while, yes, that is the case, but it's not quite the entire story. Thing is, farming was already in the process of beginning to wind down much earlier because people were beginning to want to come to Sanibel, not to farm, but to enjoy the place, to go fishing, to shell on the beach and so forth. So as early as 1923, 24, 25, they were beginning to buy up the farmers' land and plat subdivisions. I've got a whole book full of these plats here that begin back in those days. And then in 1924, are you ready for this? There was news released about the fact that they were planning to build a bridge out to Sanibel. See, this was the 20s land boom, and it caused really less land to be farmed because the land was being scooped up to be turned into, you name it, residences and so forth. As late as 1953, though, I witnessed a large-scale crop being grown on the south side of Periwinkle Way, about where the current Dixie Beach Boulevard comes out. And it started where that section line that is on Dixie Beach Boulevard runs between Island Garage and Holly's Boutique, to give you a reference. And it went east at least 400 feet, and it was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 feet in width. I'm just estimating at this point. Bigger than a football field. Now, when we went in to clear that land, I bought a piece of that in 1958. When we went in to clear that in the 70s, when we cleared the Brazilian peppers off of it, we found furrows still in place from that farming that had taken place in the 50s. And the grower was a man named Don Bass. If you've been over to Health Park Hospital, you see it's on Bass Road. It's named after Don Bass. He was a large-scale farmer. He'd been a cattle herder when he came into Lee County, as many people had been, and he became a potato farmer, of all things. And I have no idea what Don was growing. Don't remember what he might have been growing in 1953, but guessing it might have been an experiment to see if he could grow potatoes out here. And you can, because I've grown potatoes on part of that same property a couple of times in the last 5 or 6 years. So why would somebody come out to Sanibel in the 1950s for the crop experiment? Because there was warmer weather here. Much warmer weather when it would really get cold. My father told me a story about being at the Bass home one evening in the 50s, and Don kept going into his office and making phone calls. So my dad asked another one of the guests what was going on, and he was told that Don had a $500,000 crop ready to be harvested, and they were talking about a freeze that night, so he was trying to figure out what he needed to do. And that may have been the reason that he came out to Sanibel and to see if he could grow potatoes out here, was to build a little bit of a hedge in some of this. Now, having introduced my father into this, my dad loved to garden. He had 30 by 60 plot in his backyard, not quite what Don Bass has, but I don't know if any of you can see that or not. It's him standing there by it. And Dad's garden brings us to the second point that I'd like to really get into about the 1926 hurricane, perhaps killing farming on Sanibel with saltwater poisoning of the land. Now, still remember that subdivisions were already being nudged into farming beginning to go away. And I've got a whole bunch of those plats that we can look at. In the 1970s, both the Islander and Island Reporter newspapers did articles on my dad's garden, and a couple of interesting things are said in these articles. One was that in 1960, Hurricane Donna left 2 feet of salt water on top of that garden, and it stayed there for a week before it finally all soaked into the ground. No garden in 1960. But the next year, in 1961, the garden was quite successful, just 1 year later. And the reason for it is we get 40 inches of rain out here on an average every year, 40 inches plus. It comes to better than 4 feet. If I stand up, I would be about waist deep on me as the rain we get. So if you think about it, if we take these 4 feet of rain and we settle that all through Sanibel's sandy soil, there's not much salt left in that soil that would keep a crop from growing next year. So it doesn't appear that salt from water from hurricanes has that much long-term effect, just the particular year's crop. Now, getting back for a minute to the island being platted for subdivisions in 1920, what else might be going on that would be causing people to move off Sanibel that were farmers? And the land was being bought up for these subdivisions and so forth. But there was a whole portion of the people moving over to Iona, the area immediately off the island as you drive up McGregor Boulevard. And that might just be talked about as being transportation coming to that particular area, to Truckland and to Iona. It was expensive and difficult to get one's crops from Sanibel to the market. The one packing plant on Sanibel was a bit of a monopoly, although I don't know that they ever overcharged anything, but they had their expenses. Then a boat was needed to actually haul the crop that was packed there to a place where it could be put on the railroad. So Seaboard Airline Railroad came to Lee County. I'm going to add just a little soap opera to this. The Seaboard Airline president's name was S. Davies Warfield. And pay attention to the name Warfield because it was his daughter, Wallace Warfield Simpson, that brought down King Edward VIII through her romance with him. All of this stuff goes on in Lee County. Well, Mr. Wakefield, or Warfield's Seaboard Airline Railroad built a branch line towards Iona, ending on McGregor Boulevard, just east of where the Sanibel outlet stores are today, right where McGregor Boulevard makes that little bit of a turn just to the left as it's going up towards Fort Myers. The plan was to run the line all the way out to Ponderosa, but it never made it. Now, we as drivers drive on great portions of this land that was the right-of-way for that railroad. Starting with the current railroad tracks over east of Highway 41, if you come west on what's now 6 Mile Cypress, that was on the railroad right-of-way, and it ran through Lakes Park and then turned and went down Summerlin Road all the way down to where Summerlin itself turns west. But it stopped there was a siding at Gladiola's, and 2 huge packing plants for veggies were set up there. And then as you went down and Summerlin Road turned off towards the west, it went a little further and then turned west itself, and where it crossed San Carlos, going down to Fort Myers Beach, there were 2 more humongous veggie packing houses. And then it kind of worked its way westward, crossed Summerlin Road, and ended up in what's called Truckland, because they were truck farming there, and built 2 more huge packing plants there at the end of the line right up against McGregor Boulevard. It's kind of interesting. I've didn't get the map in time. I had one but lost it, but if anybody'd like to look at it, we've got a map here of that. This place called Truckland is down the road just about a half a mile from John Morris Road. And if John Morris' name doesn't mean anything to you, John Morris was a farmer on Sanibel who moved to Iona and became a farmer over there when things changed out here and became more available over there. So, as you can see, the reason for farming on Sanibel going away has multiple reasons, influences. It's not just from the saltwater impact from the hurricanes, but going back to that 1953 revival of large-scale farming for a minute, there was one other thing going on. A man named Claude Carter owned the property where Bailey's store and the restaurant is up on the corner, lived in Belden Johnson's old home. Claude came up with the idea to put in a large-scale coconut nursery, and I mean large-scale. And he offered us kids 6 cents apiece for shaker coconuts and 50 cents for a sprout. Don Hires, Alan Nave Plumbing's little brother, half-brother, and I had just decided we needed motor scooters to get around on Sanibel Island, being 15 and 16 years old. So we borrowed either my dad or his dad's truck and went coconut shaking, and it's 6 cents a piece or 50 cents per sprout. We gathered enough coconuts to finance 2 all-state motor scooters. That's a lot of coconuts. And Claude planted these furrows of these things, but the coconut nursery never came to fruition because of a family breakup. And so ended big-time farming and agriculture on Sanibel Island. And I pass my microphone to the lovely lady on my left.
Thank you. Well, it's hard to talk about racial integration without going a little bit back to the history of the black families on Sanibel. And I do have to confess that when I was asked would I do this segment on racial integration, I'm like, sure, why not? But after thinking about it a little bit more, I was like, what do I know about racial integration on Sanibel? I was not here. So I had to do a lot of research. Well, not a whole lot, but still try to go back. So let me just give you a little overview and a little background about the Gavin and the Walker families. I'm sure most of you have heard those names, I would assume. All right. Well, Hannah and Isaiah Gavin arrived in Sanibel from Wakulla County in 1917. The Gavins originally came to Sanibel to sharecrop on the island's rich and fertile soil and were the first black family to establish residency on Sanibel. The Alice and Harry Walker family came in the early 1920s from Georgia. The two families were united when the Gavin son Edmund married the Walker daughter Elnora in 1933. The few black families that settled on Sanibel Island endured isolation, no electricity, and no running water. But they would fish in the Gulf, farm tomatoes, squash and eggplant, and hunt game for dinner. They survived hurricanes, such as the hurricane of 1926 that Jim just talked about, which flooded the island with salt water and ruined much of the farmland. Afterwards, some families, both black and white, moved to the mainland. The Gavins did not. The much-beloved and respected couple lived on Sanibel for over 60 years and raised their extensive family on the island. They had 21 children, 18 survived infancy, and I think that's remarkable. That was not a blended family. So let me touch on a little bit of the segregation on the island. And I'm not sure what pictures are up behind me now, but I think you probably see the picture of Edmund and Elnora, and that's their wedding picture, 1933. Is that it? Okay. You also see a picture of what we call the cable hut, and I put that there because for a while Edmund's family lived on the land that is now referred to as Ding Dorling, and that's where he had his, I'll call it a little compound, and raised most of his family there. While the schools and many establishments were segregated, white and black children played together on the island. The education of black students in Lee County remained limited to church and private instruction until 1913, when the Lee County Board of Public Instruction, as it was called, allocated a few funds to support the education of the growing black population in Lee County. And it's important to mention about Lee County because it is intertwined with the history, the educational history here on Sanibel. The board subsequently created a segregated school in Fort Myers, which served blacks on a segregated basis until 1969. This school, which was Paul Lawrence Dunbar School, was completed in 1927. The Dunbar School served as the colored high school for the predominantly black Dunbar community and surrounding areas, including Sanibel. It was named for the renowned black poet Paul Lawrence Dunbar. Some of you may have heard or you know about the decision of the Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. Well, this is what the county awoke to find that this segregationist practice that they had been so used to was under attack. And the ruling declared separate schools for white and black students inherently unequal and thus in violation of the 13th and 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So as I said, there was really no school here on Sanibel for the black families, but there was an abandoned church that originally had been owned by the Baptist congregation. And when the storm of 1926 kind of did some damage to the island, a lot of the families did move, and they left this building vacant. The Baptist church was then converted to a school for the black families, and it was called the Sanibel Colored School. Some of you may know Lily's Jewelry Store. That is the original building. Up until that time, the black children on the island did not have a school building. In 1929, the Lee County School District bought the building, which had been built in around 1909 or 1910 from the Florida Baptist Convention, as I mentioned before, for $1,500. There was a series of principals. The first was Angelita Stafford Swain George, Miss Hazel Hammond, and others. It remained the only place of education for black children until 1963, when the Sanibel Elementary, Lee County's first integrated school, was built. I want to go back just a little bit and talk about integration and Father Madden. While the churches on Sanibel were still segregated, Father Thomas Madden of St. Michael's All Angels Episcopal Church, a civil rights activist, would conduct church and classes in any space that was available on the island for black families. Father Madden was instrumental in integrating the church and the school on Sanibel. And I'll tell you how that happened. Along with other concerned citizens of Sanibel, including Elnora Gavin and Mozella Jordan, Father Madden petitioned the school board to integrate the new school. Father Madden was asked about the segregated churches on Sanibel, and as it has been recorded in history, the school officials stated that when Sanibel integrated their churches, they would integrate the school. When the construction on St. Michael's new church was completed, Father Madden insisted that all were welcome to worship in his new church, blacks and whites alike. From that point on, the church and the Sunday school became integrated. Thus, St. Michael's became the first church on Sanibel to integrate. Other local churches soon followed Father Madden's lead. Black families no longer had to take the ferry to the mainland to worship. This milestone also paved the way for other segregated establishments and practices to change on the island. There were certain establishments where you would have the black help in the kitchen, but the other blacks were not allowed to come to the front door to buy their food or whatever it was they wanted to get from that store. The school was designated as a historic landmark in 1991. On July 8, 1999, the school was added to the U.S. National Register of Historic Places. So the Sanibel School is one of the 140 places recognized in the Florida Black Heritage Trail. The timeline, as I started to say earlier, centered around desegregation in Lee County. May 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that a separate but equal school system is unconstitutional and orders schools to desegregate. But it wasn't quite that easy, or that it didn't happen that quickly. As a matter of fact, in August 1964, the NAACP for this area filed suit in Lee County on behalf of Rosalind Blaylock, a black student who was denied access to Fort Myers High School. That suit went on for a number of years. Actually, it was not finalized or settled until July 1999. Yeah, can you imagine? So that just brings me back. I'm going to back up a little bit. So when the Sanibel School was built, it was still segregated at first until, as I said, Father Madden and the group of concerned citizens went to the local school board. So it has the Sanibel School has the distinction of being the first school in Lee County to desegregate without any type of violence or trauma, or rioting, or anything like that. So that's my little piece about racial integration on Sanibel. I should have introduced you. Forgive me. I have to introduce my colleague to my left.
Sheila Fortin. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Our story is a little different, but I'm in charge of talking about the causeway, and I had nothing to do with building it. What I wanted to say is the theme here is the people of Sanibel, and I will go on with that. In 1959, Hugo Lindgren persuaded Lee County Commission, Sanibel wasn't Sanibel yet, they were part of Lee County, to build a causeway over San Carlos Bay. Lindgren offered to cover the cost of the feasibility studies and engineering, purchase the ferry franchise, and arrange a bond issue to cover construction. As a land speculator, Lindgren hoped to increase the value of his Sanibel properties. Some Sanibel residents were very concerned that a causeway would lead to overdevelopment of the island. They feared that the character of the island would be irreparably changed. Furthermore, the Sanibel Taxpayers League claimed tolls would be insufficient to retire the required bonds. Despite their efforts, Sanibel residents' call for a referendum was defeated. The issue divided Sanibel families and friendships. There is more to say on this, but I want to bring out something about a resident of Sanibel by the name of Francis Bailey. Originally in 1963, he refused to sell his land for the original causeway. Developer Lindgren, as I stated, donated easements to persist with the building of his location where it is. And yes, he did succeed in making his property very valuable. Francis envisioned overdevelopment of the island. The cost of the original causeway was $2.73 million, and it was completed as Hugo Lindgren achieved this goal of enhancing the financial worth of his property. And there's a picture right up there. The toll facility, though small in size, has 3 traffic islands that process an average over 3 million vehicles annually, and I think we all think that it's 1 million at least in season. The causeway stirred many people on both sides. This is an interesting comment, and I quote, "No waterway structure in the history of Lee County created more controversy or changed the face and wealth of Southwest Florida as much as the causeway." For years afterwards, old-timers mentioned how they liked the island BC, before causeway. Major repairs were made in 1977 and showed deterioration in the early 2000s. The current bridge's construction commenced in August 2004, and the grand opening ceremony was in September of 2007. And if I'm not mistaken, it came at a cost of over $23 million. There were several lawsuits filed and so on, and I want to tell you about how we came to Sanibel. Don mentioned it, Don Adams. My husband saw an ad in the Wall Street Journal, if you can believe it, in the 70s, about Sanibel coming to this wonderful island, own a piece of Sanibel, same time every year, own this condo. So Don researched it, and we had 3 young children. 8 was our daughter, and 2 boys about 3. And at Christmas, we went forward, believe it or not, driving a station wagon with the toll carrier on the top, Christmas tree, goodies, and all of a sudden we land here, but the bridge goes up. And we thought, oh my God. Well, the strangest thing happened. People got out of their cars and started talking to one another, they'd say to us, "Oh, are you new to Sanibel?" Yes, we had Illinois plates. And they said, "It's wonderful. You're going to love it." And for many years thereafter, we celebrated every Christmas here at Sanibel. In about 1996, we bought here full time. And by then, our daughter, who was 8 then, had a daughter who was 8, and we go to Bailey's. And her job was to get a bag of potato chips, and she couldn't, and it was a long discussion. Along comes this man, straw hat, cane, kind of walking over kind of slowly. "May I help you, ladies? I know a little bit about this store." Well, I knew it was Francis Bailey. So Megan, our daughter, looks at me and says, I said, "Fine." So Lexi, the granddaughter, pipes up and said, "I have to find a bag of potato chips, and I can't. There's so many." And he says very nicely, "Because I know so much about the store, I think I can help you. Would it help if I showed you my favorite bag of potato chips?" This little 8-year-old said, "Oh, would you?" "Yes." So she gets the bag of potato chips, and she said, "Well, now this is my favorite." As we're checking out, the same man then checked us out, as now, many times. And there's this voice in the background, because we know Francis was always upstairs, generally in his office. And he says, "That young lady that's getting that bag of potato chips, I'm taking care of that. She and I have the same favorite potato chip." And the point behind all of this is that the people of the island make the difference. Going fast forward, now our granddaughter is older, and we're at Christmas, everybody's together, and she's getting a dog. And everybody's telling her, oh, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do everything under the sun. So she pipes up, isn't this supposed to be my dog? And we said, well, yeah. Well, can't I name the dog? We said, yeah, do you have a name? She said, yes, Bailey. And that's the dog's name. And that's my story. Thank you, everyone. I want to introduce Tyson Roski.
Oh, well, that was wonderful. I can remember as the bridge was being built, people could fish off the bridge, and afterwards we really did hate the bridge and wondered about how we could blow it up. And it's somewhat alarming now to have actually lived long enough to have outlived the bridge, that they rebuilt it, but I do consider it a sign of progress that when they rebuilt it, they didn't four-lane it. They just added bicycle paths, and I do consider that a great sign of. I'm speaking about governance, and the bridge played a great part in Sanibel's development as a city because that infrastructure has allowed a lot of people to come onto the island. But it wasn't just the bridge that did that. It was also, I think, probably getting the water company, the Island Water Association, because prior to the Island Water Association, we had basically 3 sources of water. Our well water at our house smelled like rotten eggs. It stained all the fixtures. It was miserable. And then my cousins had cistern water, and you had to boil that. And I actually had a cousin that got type 1 diabetes from cistern water. It was in North Carolina, but he didn't boil it, and he got type 1 diabetes, so that was a lousy source of water. And all of our drinking and cooking and brushing our teeth water came from Bailey's General Store in these big, heavy 5-gallon jugs of water that always ran out at the least opportune time. So getting the Island Water Association was a critical component to subsequent development of the island. And that was in 1968. Well, I went off to college a few years later in 1970, and there were twice as many people in my dormitory that were living on Sanibel at the time. When I came back a few years later, having graduated, the population had grown from 500 people to well over several thousand people just in a few years. And the county, the island of Sanibel was allowing this large development, and large tracts of land were being cleared of all sorts of wildlife and native habitat, and there were large condominiums being developed, and the style of development were, a lot of the yards would be plastic yards, and also there were condominiums that the economic competition amongst them was how close could they build to mean height water, because everybody felt it was desirable to have your house close, or condominium unit or whatever, close to the water. And irregardless of what that meant to the beach, that competition was, we're going to build close to the water. And I think everybody realized that was not a really good way to do it, but you had to outdo your competition. And it was just a matter of time before we were going to be the Miami Beach with the high rises and virtually the entire island cleared of all native habitat. And the county zoning was allowing over 30,000 dwelling units. And knowing that zoning tends to allow more, I personally think that had we stayed under the county's zoning administration, and government, we would have had certainly more than 30,000 dwelling units. In response to that, the people on Sanibel really did get involved in the incorporation movement. And I think a major component of that was having the newspaper involved, the Island Reporter, which was being editorial. The head editor was Don Whitehead, that was involved with it. And it was a very community effort, and we just barely squeaked under the wire to get incorporated as a city. Had it been delayed just perhaps a few days, the threshold for a community was raised, and we would never have been incorporated as a city. Subsequently, the city involved a moratorium to prevent the development that the county was allowing. And in fact, once the vote went through, there was a lineup at the building department in the county to just get all your building permits approved just like that, and the county government was just issuing them just like that. And it was a major effort of the community's legal team to deal with that so-called vested development. Sanibel hired a very reputable comprehensive planning firm, Wallace, McCard, Roberts, and Todd. Ian McCarg had written a book called Design with Nature, and we proceeded to develop a plan based on Sanibel's nature. I was very fortunate to have been somewhat involved. My aunt was involved with the historic preservation aspect of it, but there were a lot of task forces that the people of the community were involved with. It was really a total community effort. The city did adopt the comprehensive plan finally around in 1976. I was fortunate at that point to get a job in the planning department implementing that new plan. It was a very exciting time as we worked to essentially change some of the style of development. And I knew we had the right team working with us when I walked up with them to look at some property in the Bowman's Beach area. I think we were thinking of buying it. And some people had left a lot of garbage, a lot of beer cans or something like that. And our fancy attorneys from Chicago just naturally bent over and started picking up this litter. And that was when I knew we really had the right team working for our community. It was a very exciting time to be working with us. Had we not had this, with the incorporation of the city, we really developed Sanibel's style of development of bike paths, vegetation, and certainly the wildlife has come back well in the many years since then. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Todd. I'm going to be talking a little bit about wildlife, and like Don Adams, my husband and I came to Sanibel first we started in 1989, and we were looking for a place where we could vacation and eventually retire. He suggested coastal Florida, and I was a little bit skeptical. After all, isn't coastal Florida the place that they covered with concrete and asphalt, and they ripped out all the mangroves and put in seawalls? I mean, I think of coastal Florida as the home of the strip mall. But he told me that there was this lovely island called Sanibel, and it had a lot of birds on it. Now, this piqued my attention. I've been a bird watcher for years, so we came to Sanibel, came over the causeway, loved what we saw, and headed toward Ding Darling. Well, I had never seen anything like it before, birds all over the place, and I knew that this was the place for me. Fortunately, my husband agreed. Wildlife thrives on Sanibel. 2/3 of the island is in permanent conservation and provides habitat for wildlife. The city of Sanibel recognizes the importance of wildlife and created a vision statement. And here's the first sentence in that vision statement. Sanibel is and shall remain a barrier island sanctuary, one in which a diverse population lives in harmony with the island's wildlife and natural habitats. So how did Sanibel become this way? Let's go back in time to the 1880s when the federal government opened Sanibel to homesteaders. People came, claimed a piece of land, they farmed for at least 5 years, and then they were able to gain title to the land. The early settlers had to kind of fend for themselves. Water was always a challenge to get, either through through digging a well or collecting rainwater. And for food, well, they had to farm or hunt or fish. So wildlife for these early settlers was really a source of food. It's hard to imagine this today, but gopher tortoises and sea turtles provided meat for soups and stews. People gathered turtle eggs and used them in cooking and baking. Wild birds like ibis were prepared the way you'd prepare chicken. People hunted alligators and deer. There were actually deer on the island back then. This was subsistence hunting, and it persisted in Sanibel into the first couple of decades of the 20th century. But the early 20th century also saw the beginning of a movement toward wildlife conservation. And the pivotal figure in this movement, for me at least, is Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was an ardent birdwatcher, hunter, fisherman, and conservationist. He believed that wildlife needed protected habitat to thrive and that hunting should be limited. So to this end, in 1903, Teddy Roosevelt created the first national wildlife refuge on Pelican Island off the east coast of Florida. He had heard that the pelicans on the island were being slaughtered by hunters as they came in to roost and to nest. So Teddy Roosevelt, being president, created a wildlife refuge where hunting was prohibited. During his presidency, Teddy Roosevelt created over 50 refuges, and 3 of them, as it turns out, are near Sanibel. They are small rookery islands, and they are today part of the Ding Darling Refuge Complex. Sanibel also had a pivotal figure in its embrace of wildlife conservation, and of course that's J. Norwood Darling. Ding Darling was a Pulitzer Prize-winning political cartoonist. Like Roosevelt, he liked to go birding, he liked to hunt and fish, and he was an ardent conservationist. Some of his cartoons warned about the dangers of habitat destruction and overhunting. In the early 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt appointed Ding Darling to head the newly formed Bureau of Biological Survey. This was the group that oversaw the national wildlife refuges. During his very short time in office, Ding Darling focused on preserving wetlands. He expanded the refuge system, and most significantly, he succeeded in getting what's called the Migratory Bird Hunting Act approved. We usually call that the Federal Duck Stamp Act. Now, duck stamps have nothing to do with postage, as I suspect you know, but rather, duck stamps have to be purchased by hunters and carried with them when they hunt for geese and for ducks. The revenue collected from the sale of duck stamps is placed in a special fund that can be used only for the acquisition of wetlands. So since the first duck stamp was sold in 1934, over $800 million has been placed in a fund. And from that, more than 5.7 million acres of wildlife habitat has been acquired. Some of it, by the way, in Ding Darling. To me, this is an incredibly wonderful success story and a beautiful example of a self-funding program. Ding Darling first came to Sanibel and Captiva in 1935, and he liked what he found here. The winters were mild, the fishing and birding was good, and he found that many islanders shared his commitment to wildlife conservation. He worked with them to advocate for conservation, and their efforts paid off. In 1939, the state of Florida declared that Sanibel and Captiva was a state wildlife refuge where hunting was prohibited. His great contribution to the islands came in the 1940s. Ding Darling learned that the state of Florida was planning to sell a couple thousand acres of mangrove forest and tidal flats to a developer of all people. Ding Darling was appalled. He couldn't imagine destroying a beautiful habitat like this. After all, where are the spoonbills going to go? Darling was well connected politically. He was a forceful advocate, and he wound up persuading the governor of Florida to stop the sale. Instead, the federal government leased the land from the state, and in 1945 created the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge. Ding Darling died in 1962, and a group of islanders formed the Ding Darling Memorial Committee. This was headed by Emmy Lou Lewis, and the committee wanted to create a permanent memorial for Ding Darling. This took 5 years, but they finally persuaded the federal government to rename the refuge in Ding's honor, the first time a refuge was named for a person. And the federal government also managed to gain title to these refuge lands by doing a land swap with the state of Florida. This ensured that the land could not be sold in the future by the state. But the committee didn't stop there. As Ty was talking about, they were very concerned about the possibility of overdevelopment on Sanibel. That causeway had gone in, the water association had gone in, people were coming to the island, buying land, talking about development. The committee certainly didn't want to see Sanibel go the way of many other barrier islands in Florida. So in 1967, they formed a nonprofit land trust and called it the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, with Emmy Lou Lewis again as its first chair. SCCF began acquiring land and today manages 1,800 acres of land on Sanibel and Captiva and conducts programs for wildlife conservation, water quality, public education, and they work very closely with Ding Darling and with the city of Sanibel. And finally, no discussion of wildlife would be complete without talking about Shirley Walters. In 1968, with the help of a veterinarian, Dr. Phyllis Douglas, Shirley began treating wildlife in her home because there was treating injured wildlife in her home because there was nobody else to do it. This led to the founding in 1972 of CROW, the Clinic for the Rehabilitation of Wildlife. Today, CROW has a state-of-the-art hospital where they treat over 4,000 patients every year, and they share the knowledge and techniques that they've gained in wildlife rehabilitation with hospitals all over the country. So let me leave you with a final thought. As you're taking a walk or going on a bike ride and you see an alligator basking by a pond or a flock of egrets and herons foraging on a tidal flat, remember that that was made possible by the vision, the foresight, and the tenacity of the people who came before us. Thank you.
One of the problems with being last is everything has already been said. My topic was community, and of course everyone touches upon community when we're talking about Sanibel because we are such a strong, vibrant community. As a group of people on this small island, we participate and volunteer for all sorts of causes. Our churches, Clean Water, SCCF, Fish Crow, Historical Village, Big Arts, and lots more. But this tradition started long before 1927 when we built this community house. As I was growing up in this community, I understood that everyone on the island, the community, was involved in making this a safe and healthy place to live. The community house was where we met for Mr. Starbucks movies, potluck suppers, square dancing, teen club, and the school Christmas play. My favorite year was the year I was an angel dressed in white sheets and my friend Diane Ballinger was married. As she sang the challenging song of "O Holy Night," a dachshund in the audience joined in her solo. And she bravely soldiered on to the end and got a standing ovation. I'm sure that Mr. Pickens could tell you similar stories. And of course, the Shell Fair was the community event of the year. School kids worked all year collecting and identifying shells, as our entry was the majority of our science grade for the year. I remember only getting as high as second prize, and I can tell you red is not my favorite color. The community house was also where the community nurse came to give us shots. And the one I vividly remember was getting a tetanus shot that we all got after Hurricane Donna ripped through, that left us without electricity for over a month. The spirit of the community was so strong then, when every man worked to clear the roads of downed pines and trees. We didn't have the heavy machinery that we have today, but we had the community spirit. The community also gathered by necessity at the ferry docks. you could easily wait 30 minutes in line for the next ferry. So rather than sit in the hot car, you would swap news with those other travelers in line, and those conversations might continue once you were on board. The kids might gather in the open passenger cabin on the newer ferries, like the Yankee Clipper, which was so aptly named. And the community park at the time was on the Gulf side across from the ferry docks, and it was called Kinsey Park. The community would meet there for fish fries, and you might also join into like a sack race or a pickup softball game. And I kind of miss that kind of park activity. But one of the favorite, almost daily community meeting places was the Bayside Bailey store. Francis Bailey was almost certainly always there, and everyone came to buy necessities, send telegrams, and catch up on island hubbub. While my father might be chewing the fat with Francis, or Glenn Rhodes, or Pat Murphy, the mailman who knew everything, we kids would be waiting for the mailboat or just doing cannonballs off the end of the dock into the coolest, deepest water on the island. These were some of the daily events that bound us all together. The community built the library in phases. We started here in the community house. We built churches, and we served on decades of all-volunteer fire department. My dad was nozzle man on team number 2. We formed organizations to protect the natural environment, as well as committees to protect our island from county rule overreach. We fought against development, and when it came anyway, we as a community fought to become a city, thereby protecting our way of life. So we've always been a hands-on community, and that's the community spirit that we need to continue to foster. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I really learned the history of Sanibel. And that history is the prologue to our island story. We need to understand it and learn from its lessons. I know everyone here on the committee feels that the Heritage Trail may be popular with visitors, but its best value is with the community that lives here now. I'm hoping that the community, young and old, will take the time to walk or bike to each panel. I'm hoping everyone in the community enjoys it at their leisure, or maybe even as part of a school program. And maybe it will inspire even more folks to continue this community spirit of Sanibel. Being last, you're also tired and hungry and thirsty, but we do have time for questions. And Craig, would you like to lead the questions? Okay. Okay. All right. Some questions, folks. I know you have a couple.
All right, folks. Yep, if you got any questions for the panelists, just raise your hand and I'll come over with the mic and you can ask away. Lady in the blue.
I've heard so much about the Sanibel tomato. I have no idea how big it was or how it tasted, but I heard the story that the New York restaurants always look forward to the Sanibel tomatoes, and so I'd like a little story on that.
Well, in one of these articles that is about my dad's garden, there's some pictures of some of the things that he grew in the garden, and somewhere, if I can find it, is a picture that has, and of course I looked in the wrong folder, that has some of these tomatoes there. Now, the Sanibel tomato per se was multiple varieties. One of the things I think that made the tomato, and I can't explain it, but something to do with the soil here, which is unique. We're out on an island, we're et cetera, created a flavor, a taste. And I can tell you, I grow some tomatoes every once in a while in the back of my place, since it's a proven farm. And they are that. My dad talks about all the different varieties that he tried to grow. And in one of the articles, he says this was a huge thing. But after this is over, if you'll come up here, there's a picture of 4 of them that he grew on top of a little stool, and the hand that's holding them barely would be completely filled with that tomato.
Do we have a question from the right side of the room?
Long range, what is your biggest concern? What is the biggest vulnerability that the island of Sanibel has?
Are we talking from a historical point of view, of preservation, or where the island itself is going to ultimately grow up to be? Well,
I was just sort of thinking in some regards that the bridge allowed a lot of people to come onto the island. But it has also allowed a lot of people to leave the island. Before the bridge, anybody that worked on the island lived on the island, and the community involved everybody that way. And what has happened, I think, is that the bridge has allowed people to leave, and we don't have all the elements of the community living in our community. And that's my longest range problem that I see with the community.
Can I get a question from someone in the back of the room?
You want to add to that?
I'm just going to add to that, too, that people leaving here. I can't remember the lady's name. I will at 3 o'clock in the morning. But there was a lady lived down at the end of Doneck Street in one of the old farmhouses there. And the day that they allowed the bridge to be built, she packed and moved.
I have a question for you. How many hurricanes has hit the island in the last, 112 years? How many hurricanes have destroyed us?
How many hurricanes have hit?
I can't tell you, but I'll count backwards a little bit for you quickly. Donna in 1960 was the last one that put significant water across the island. Now, we've had a couple that have brushed us since then. Prior to that, 1952, I was standing on the porch at Casabel. My mother was managing the place, and I'd been drafted into service to wait tables that summer. It was the first summer Casabel was open. And it was summer '53, and I walked out after breakfast, and the surf was up, and as I watched it, it got upper and upper, and the next thing I knew, the surf was running under the building and all the way up Casabel Road to where it turns and goes east. Turned out to be called Hurricane Hazel later on in its history. The last the major storm before that was in 1947. There was one in 1944 that put salt water clear across Sanibel, except for the very high points up on Wolfert. Prior to that, I think we have to go back to 1935 or 36. There was another storm that flooded the island. Then in 24 and 26, both we had storms, and beyond that, my memory doesn't work.
I think we have time for a couple other questions. Anyone over here?
I just wonder, everyone has history, documents, photographs from early times. Is there a repository on the island where you can go look at and find all the early history in one place? You have photographs,
repository.
plats, things of that nature would be fun to see.
The Sanibel Library is a major repository for Sanibel photographs, and they have the 3,000 pages of newspaper clippings, and they also have transferred a lot of their materials to the state archives in Tallahassee, and you can look up Sanibel on the state archives, and there are at least 300 to 400 photos, historical photos there.
There's also quite a collection of Sanibel material at Florida Gulf Coast University, which is here in Lee County, a little to the south of us and across 41.
So I saw a
there's
hand
also-
raised all the way over here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say there's also the Florida Memory Project online that you can find a lot of the history, some of the history.
My question is, what happened during the war, during the Second World War? What was the war effort here on the island? You see the plaque up near the lighthouse pertaining to a submarine observation spot, but that's about as much as I know.
It was reasonably extensive. The Bowman's Beach area up towards the very west end of the island was a strafing range for pilots that were in training. And occasionally they would get a little too low and fire a little too quick, and various houses up and down the island would have the bottoms of tin cans nailed on their roofs where a bullet hole had gone through. They built a barracks down in 1943. They built a barracks, what they called a barracks at the lighthouse. And my father's business partner is a man named Broward Keene when he went into the construction business in the early 50s. Broward came to the island from Pine Island. He grew up out there, and he came over here to occupy a submarine observation tower that had been built east of the lighthouse. And the barracks was for the people that manned that to stay in. They manned it round the clock. If you go down there and go to a picnic area just to the north of the actual lighthouse out towards the bay and go straight out to the bay from those tables at low tide, if you look, you'll find 4 concrete piling or footers out there. That's where that tower stood out there. We also had to drive with blackout lights at night on the cars because they were afraid that anything offshore might shell the island. But again, the population was very small. When I was a senior in high school, I think maybe 300 people living on both islands. So it was more the island got utilized than the people on the island did things.
One little story from my parents was my father graduated from West Point in 1940, got his trained as a pilot, and was one of the first people out heading off to New Guinea, and was involved in flying B-17s in New Guinea, and finally got back and came to Sanibel to relax. And he and my mother were walking on the beach, and there was a sign that they could see in front of them, but the writing was faced away from them. So they came up to the sign and got past it to see what it was saying. It says, "Do not enter strafing range." And years later, we would find the shells of those bullets that had been flying out of the plane.
No, I was going to wait until everything was finished. Are we just about finished? I have an
I'll
announcement to
take
make.
another couple questions,
Oh,
and then,
go ahead, take
yeah,
it.
absolutely.
This is not a question, but the first gentleman tonight, we weren't quite sure how to do this. Did they get applause like everyone else? I thought it'd be nice if we gave him a round of applause.
Anyone else with a question? Thank you so much.
I have a question of Sheila and your research on the causeway. Did you find out what the original toll was coming to the island back in '63 when it opened?
I think we all know. Go ahead. It was $3, and then it went up to $6, and there was a lot of controversy about that. Oh, it was 3, yeah. And then it went up to 6, but $3. And I wanted to say something about the hurricanes. You know, and was anybody here for the Friday the 13th hurricane, Charlie? Do we remember how the city had an emergency team set up, had a loan at the bank for $10 million? If we needed it, they could draw on it. How everyone evacuated the island. They set up a command central in Fort Myers. It was what is now the Crown Plaza restaurant or hotel. And one of the most important things was that they were able to get the people out here by helicopter, I guess, to bring in the types of machinery without electricity so that the sewer waters didn't back up. And I think that's a great, what shall I say, acumen that we give to the city, how much forethought they went into that. Many of us were trained so that we couldn't come back on the island, but when we went for our daily report at the Crown Plaza, we were told what we were to do when we were to get back to help people get on the island. And it was very, very devastating. Thank you.
Let me put an addendum on that. The toll was $3, and people would say, my gosh, that's a lot of money. But let me tell you, if I took a car with my wife and 2 of my children in it on the ferry, they charged me $1 for the car and 50 cents for each head in it. That was $3 each way. So that was $6. And I got a free saltwater bath on the car.
I have a question regarding the landing strip that used to be on the island. When my husband and I started coming here in 1968, we lived in Miami and we would fly across. But I don't know anything about the history of when we had a little airstrip and how it started and why and how we lost it.
They built a little airstrip behind Sanibel. Somewhere in my photographs here, I think I've got a picture of it. And it was just a dirt strip. Began building it in 1953, and it was open for use that year. One of my first jobs out of high school was going out there with a tractor and a mower and keeping it mowed. It stayed open until they began to build what we call high-rise on Sanibel, stuff that's 3 and 4 stories along the beach at the end of the runway, and then you could no longer gain enough altitude to safely get over those buildings, so they had to close it. In case we wonder, the biggest airplane that ever came in here was a DC-3 that came in with one engine out and it failing, other one failing badly. And they got it off by waiting for an east wind, very strong east wind, and putting a minimum amount of fuel on it and barely clearing Sanibel Road as he took off.
So we'll take one more.
There's a picture of the aircraft landed at Sanibel.
Our panelists will take one last question here before we wrap things up.
This is not a question, but if anybody wants more information about Sanibel, please come to the Historical Village. We're open 5 days a week, and we've got lots of pictures and a lot of information. And the Preservation Committee is the guys behind it. So we would love to see you. A lot of people who live on Sanibel have never been there, and it's a shame because the visitors love it. So thank you to the Preservation Committee for doing what you do, and thanks to the people on the Historical Society.
So technically, that was not a question, and we'll do one more here before we get things done. I know she's been waiting patiently on the left side of the room.
I'm embarrassed. I was going to say the same thing. Come to the Historical Village, and we're even growing Sanibel tomatoes there, at least we're really trying. And we have many of the buildings that you've seen in the film, and docents who can tell a wonderful story, all in response to this gentleman's inquiry about us as a resource. Thank you. That doesn't count as a question.
Anyone else?
Is there concern about sea level rise and how it's going to affect Sanibel?
Yeah.
That's certainly nothing that we've touched upon in the Historic Preservation Committee. But I do know if you talk to someone like Charles LaBeouf, who lived at the lighthouse, when he lived there in 1958, he had water underneath his cottage. He actually could throw a cast net from his porch and catch mullet. So in his mind, we haven't really experienced any great influx of water at this point because there's more land there now than there was in 1958. Do we have refreshments?
I
do know in the city, in Key West, over the last 100 years, in the Navy infrastructure there, they had experienced a 9-inch sea level rise in 100 years, and that's been pretty well documented. And I think that if that trend, that documented historical trend continues to our sandy islands, that we will find more and more efforts at shoreline hardening and protection, and that's going to be a big issue in our community over the years.
Okay, well, this is just an announcement, since we're talking about community and history. This is the centennial for the Gavin family, 100 years. So I just wanted to mention that. They came here in 1917, and they'll be having their big family reunion in August right here at the community house. So just wanted everybody to be aware of that.
I walked into a doctor's office. I can't think of the name of the office now. It's next to the Bank of the Islands down here. And there's a young lady in there behind the counter, and I looked at her, and I said, "You're a Gavin." She said, "How do you know?" And I say, "Because you've got Eleanor's face written all over you." So next time you go in there and see her, if you do, just look at her and say, "You're a Gavin."
All right, everyone. So that concludes tonight's presentation. Thank you so much for spending time with us.